By the beginning of 1916, the First World War had already been raging for more than 18 months. What many European leaders had expected to be a short conflict had become a grinding struggle stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss frontier. Vast trench systems cut across the landscape. Armies numbering in the millions faced one another across narrow strips of devastated land. Neither side had achieved the decisive victory it had hoped for in 1914. The war had become a contest of endurance. For soldiers living in the trenches, daily life was defined by mud, cold, disease, artillery fire, and uncertainty. Entire offensives often resulted in minimal territorial gains while producing enormous casualties. Military leaders on both sides searched desperately for a way to break the deadlock. In Germany, one commander believed he had found a solution. His name was Erich von Falkenhayn. The strategy he developed would lead to one of the most infamous battles in military history. Not because of the territory gained, not because of strategic breakthroughs, but because of the staggering human cost. Falkenhayn concluded that Germany could not easily defeat all of its enemies through traditional offensives. Instead, he proposed a different approach. His objective was not necessarily to capture large amounts of territory. His objective was to force France into a battle so important that French leaders would commit every available resource to defending it. If enough casualties could be inflicted, France might eventually collapse under the weight of its losses. The target chosen for this strategy was Verdun. Located along a salient in the French lines, Verdun possessed enormous symbolic importance. For centuries, the fortress region had guarded approaches into northeastern France. Its forts, defensive positions, and historical significance made it a source of national pride. Falkenhayn believed the French would defend Verdun at any cost. If he was correct, Germany could force France into a battle of attrition unlike anything seen before. It was a cold calculation, one based not on maneuver, but on the expectation of mass casualties. The German offensive began on February 21, 1916. At dawn, thousands of artillery pieces opened fire. What followed was one of the largest bombardments the world had ever witnessed. 4 hours, shells rained down upon French positions. Entire forests were shattered. Roads disappeared beneath explosions. Trenches collapsed. Communication lines were destroyed. Soldiers sheltered underground as the earth shook around them. Many later described the experience as standing inside an endless earthquake. The bombardment was designed not only to destroy defenses but also to break morale before German infantry advanced. When the shelling finally lifted, assault troops moved forward through smoke, mud, and debris. The Battle of Verdun had begun. And for the men trapped inside it, life would never be the same again. The opening days of the offensive produced alarming results for the French defenders. German forces advanced through sectors that had been devastated by artillery. In some areas, entire defensive positions had ceased to exist. Survivors emerged from shelters to find familiar landmarks erased from the landscape. The scale of destruction created confusion throughout the French lines. Units became separated. Communications failed. Commanders struggled to understand the rapidly changing situation. One of the most significant setbacks came with the loss of Fort Douaumont. Douaumont was the largest and most powerful fort in the Verdun defensive system. Built to protect the region from invasion, it was considered one of the strongest fortifications in Europe. Yet in a shocking turn of events, a relatively small German force managed to enter and capture the fort with far less resistance than anyone expected. The news spread quickly across France. Military leaders feared that Verdun itself might soon fall. For German commanders, the capture of Douaumont appeared to confirm that the offensive was succeeding. For the French nation, however, it served as a warning. If Verdun was to survive, extraordinary measures would be required. The responsibility for saving Verdun soon fell to General Philippe Pétain. At the time, Pétain was not yet one of the most famous commanders in France. However, his leadership during the coming months would make him a national hero. Upon arriving in the Verdun sector, Pétain immediately recognized the scale of the crisis. The German assault was relentless. Troops at the front required a constant flow of ammunition, food, medical supplies, and reinforcements. Without an effective logistics system, the defense would collapse. To solve this problem, French authorities relied on a single supply route connecting Verdun to the rear. The road became known as the Voie sacrée, or Sacred Way. Day and night, an endless stream of trucks moved along the route. Vehicles transported soldiers toward the battlefield and carried wounded men away from it. The road became the lifeline of Verdun. Its importance was difficult to overstate. As long as supplies continued to arrive, the French army could continue fighting. And continue fighting it did. As spring approached, Verdun became a battlefield unlike any seen before. The landscape was transformed by continuous artillery fire. Fields became cratered wastelands. Forests were reduced to shattered stumps. Entire hills changed shape under the force of repeated bombardments. Soldiers often struggled to recognize terrain shown on their maps because the environment had been altered so dramatically. Life at the front was defined by exhaustion. Men spent days under artillery fire, uncertain whether the next shell would land nearby. Sleep was scarce. Food was inconsistent. Medical care was overwhelmed. The psychological strain was immense. Many soldiers described feeling trapped in a world where danger never disappeared. Even during moments of relative calm, the sound of distant guns reminded them that death could arrive without warning. Verdun was becoming more than a battle. It was becoming a symbol of industrialized warfare at its most brutal. Throughout the spring and summer of 1916, both sides launched repeated attacks and counterattacks. German forces sought to continue their advance toward key objectives. French defenders fought desperately to hold every position they could. Sometimes a single hill, trench, bunker, or ruined structure became the focus of days or even weeks of combat. The gains were often measured in meters. The casualties were measured in thousands. Artillery remained the dominant weapon on the battlefield. Far more soldiers were killed or wounded by shells than by rifles. The constant bombardment created conditions that many survivors later struggled to describe. Explosions occurred day and night. Dust filled the air. Bodies were buried and uncovered repeatedly by incoming fire. The battlefield itself seemed alive with destruction. Yet neither side was willing to abandon the fight. Each believed victory remained possible. And each continued paying an extraordinary price. Among the most fiercely contested locations were Fort Douaumont and Fort Vaux. These fortifications became symbols of resistance, determination, and sacrifice. At Fort Vaux, French defenders endured extreme conditions while resisting repeated German assaults. Water became scarce. Air quality deteriorated inside the underground chambers. Supplies dwindled. Yet the defenders continued fighting long after many observers believed resistance was impossible. Their stand became one of the most famous episodes of the battle. Across Verdun, stories of individual courage emerged amid unimaginable suffering. Messengers crossed artillery-swept terrain. Medical personnel treated wounded soldiers under fire. Engineers repaired roads and communication lines despite constant danger. The battle was no longer defined solely by military objectives. It had become a test of endurance, a test of morale, a test of how much punishment human beings could endure while continuing to fight. By the middle of 1916, the Battle of Verdun had already consumed enormous amounts of men, ammunition, and resources. What had begun as a carefully planned German operation was evolving into exactly the kind of struggle both sides had hoped to avoid, a prolonged battle of attrition. German units that had entered the offensive with confidence now faced many of the same hardships as their opponents. They endured relentless artillery fire, difficult terrain, exhaustion, and mounting casualties. The battlefield showed little regard for nationality. French and German soldiers alike suffered under the same rain, mud, shellfire, and fear. Military commanders continued searching for opportunities to gain an advantage, but the battlefield increasingly resisted decisive action. Every attack required tremendous preparation. Every advance came at a cost. Every success seemed temporary. As losses mounted, it became increasingly difficult to justify the price being paid for small pieces of devastated ground. Yet neither side was prepared to concede defeat. Verdun had become more than a military operation. It had become a matter of national prestige. During the summer of 1916, events elsewhere on the Western Front began to influence the battle. In July, Allied forces launched the Battle of the Somme. The offensive opened another massive front and forced German commanders to redistribute troops and resources. For the German High Command, this created a serious dilemma. Verdun remained important, but so did every other sector under pressure. The ability to concentrate overwhelming force at Verdun gradually diminished. Meanwhile, French resistance continued to strengthen. The logistical network established by Pétain kept reinforcements flowing toward the battlefield. Units rotated through the sector, ensuring that a large portion of the French army shared the burden of defending Verdun. The battle remained deadly. The artillery remained relentless. But the momentum that had once favored Germany was beginning to shift. The offensive that was supposed to weaken France now threatened to drain German strength as well. As autumn approached, French commanders began launching increasingly effective counteroffensives. Their objective was not merely to hold Verdun. It was to reclaim lost ground. Months of brutal fighting had altered the balance of the battlefield. German forces remained dangerous, but they were no longer advancing with the momentum seen earlier in the year. French artillery improved its effectiveness. Coordination between infantry and artillery became more refined. Carefully planned attacks began producing results. One of the most significant achievements came with efforts to retake key positions that had fallen during the early stages of the battle. Among them was Fort Douaumont. The fort, whose capture had once symbolized German success, was now becoming a target for French recovery operations. Its strategic value remained important. Its symbolic value was even greater. For France, recovering lost ground represented more than a military victory. It represented proof that Verdun could endure. In October 1916, French forces successfully recaptured Fort Douaumont. The achievement was celebrated throughout France. For months, the fort had stood as a reminder of the difficult opening phase of the battle. Now it symbolized resilience and recovery. The success boosted morale among troops and civilians alike. Additional operations followed. French forces continued pressing forward, gradually recovering territory that had been lost earlier in the year. The battlefield remained dangerous. The casualty lists continued to grow. But the strategic situation had changed. Germany no longer possessed the initiative it had enjoyed during the opening stages of the offensive. The battle was slowly moving toward its conclusion. Neither side had achieved the decisive breakthrough once envisioned by military planners. Instead, Verdun had become a demonstration of the limits of offensive warfare in the age of industrial conflict. By December 1916, the Battle of Verdun was finally approaching its end. For 303 days, soldiers had fought through conditions that many survivors would later struggle to describe. Entire sectors of the battlefield had been transformed into landscapes resembling another planet. Forests had vanished. Villages had been erased. Hills had been reshaped by millions of artillery impacts. The physical destruction was staggering. The human cost was even greater. Both France and Germany had committed enormous resources to the struggle. Generation after generation of young soldiers had passed through Verdun's trenches, forts, and shattered fields. Many never returned home. Others survived carrying wounds that would remain with them for the rest of their lives. As the fighting gradually subsided, military leaders began assessing the results. The conclusions were sobering. Neither side had achieved the decisive strategic victory originally envisioned. Instead, Verdun had become a symbol of endurance, sacrifice, and the terrible cost of modern warfare. The casualty figures remain difficult to comprehend even today. Historians continue debating exact numbers, but it is widely accepted that approximately 700,000 casualties occurred during the battle, including killed, wounded, missing, and captured soldiers. The scale of suffering shocked contemporaries and left a lasting impression on future generations. For France, Verdun became a national symbol. The phrase, "They shall not pass," became forever associated with the determination shown by the defenders. For Germany, the battle demonstrated the enormous limitations of attritional warfare. The strategy intended to weaken France had also consumed vast German resources. Across Europe, Verdun became synonymous with the horrors of industrialized conflict. Its name joined a growing list of places that represented the brutality of the First World War. The battle did not end the war, but it changed how many people understood it. No longer could the conflict be viewed as a short campaign. It had become a struggle capable of consuming entire nations. More than a century later, Verdun remains one of the most powerful symbols of World War I. Visitors who walk the former battlefield today still encounter evidence of the immense destruction that occurred there. Craters remain visible. Memorials stand where soldiers once fought. Cemeteries stretch across the landscape, reminding future generations of the price paid during those 303 days. Verdun teaches an enduring lesson about the nature of war. Military plans often begin with objectives, calculations, and expectations. But once conflict begins, events rarely unfold as predicted. The commanders who launched the offensive expected to achieve strategic results. Instead, they created one of history's longest and bloodiest battles. For hundreds of thousands of soldiers, Verdun became a test of survival. For France, it became a symbol of national determination. For the world, it became a warning. A warning about the consequences of industrial warfare, military escalation, and the belief that victory can be achieved without unimaginable sacrifice. The guns of Verdun fell silent in 1916. Its lessons still echo today. For 303 days, Verdun consumed men, ammunition, landscapes, and entire communities. It became a battle where victory and defeat were often difficult to distinguish. Measured in territory, the gains were limited. Measured in human lives, the cost was enormous. Verdun demonstrated the full reality of industrial warfare and became one of the defining battles of the 20th century. Its story remains a reminder that the greatest consequences of war are often borne not by generals or politicians, but by the ordinary men and women caught within it.